They say a man can only take so much before he breaks. They say grief has a limit, that the human heart can only absorb so much pain before it simply stops trying. On May 18, 1990, at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, the world witnessed that breaking point. They watched as Dean Martin, the man who had perfected the art of looking unbothered, who had spent a lifetime playing it cool, finally shattered into 1,000 pieces in front of everyone. The funeral of Sammy Davis Jr. was supposed to be a celebration of life. It was supposed to be a send-off worthy of Mr. Entertainment, filled with music, laughter, and stories of a life lived at full volume. And it was all those things. But it was also the day that Dean Martin's carefully constructed armor crumbled, revealing the raw, bleeding wounds underneath. It was the day he whispered words so devastating that grown men wept and women covered their mouths in shock. This is the untold story of that moment. This is the story of what Dean Martin said at his best friend's casket, and why those words carried away a man who had already died inside, but whose body refused to stop breathing. The last piece of his heart. To understand what happened at Sammy's funeral, you need to understand where Dean Martin was in his life at that moment in May of 1990. He wasn't the same man who had crooned at Amore or clinked glasses with Frank Sinatra in front of millions. That Dean Martin had ceased to exist 3 years earlier on a snowy mountainside where his son's fighter jet had crashed into granite and ice. By the time Sammy Davis Jr. lay dying of throat cancer in the spring of 1990, Dean had already become a ghost. He was 72 years old, but he looked ancient. His face, once so animated and mischievous, had settled into a mass of permanent sadness. The twinkle in his eyes had been replaced by a dull, faraway stare. He barely left his house on Mountain Drive in Beverly Hills. He had stopped performing. He had stopped socializing. He had stopped caring about anything except getting through another day without his son. The loss of Dino Jr. in 1987 had been a nuclear bomb dropped directly on Dean's soul. It had vaporized his will to live. Friends who visited him said it was like talking to a mannequin. He would nod, smile weakly, say the right things, but there was nobody home. The lights were on, but the building was condemned. He went through the motions of existence, eating, sleeping, watching television. But he wasn't really there anymore. Part of him, the essential part, had climbed into that casket with his son and refused to come back out. In those 3 years between Dino's death and Sammy's funeral, Dean had exactly 2 things that kept him tethered to this world. The first was routine. The second was Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy was the last living connection to the golden age, to the days when life made sense and the future held promise. Sammy represented the brotherhood, the laughter, the music, the magic. When Frank would call, Dean often wouldn't pick up. When old friends reached out, Dean would make excuses. But when Sammy called, Dean answered. They had been through everything together. They had conquered Vegas together. They had faced down racism and bigotry together in the 60s when hotels wouldn't let Sammy stay in the same building where he performed. They had drunk together, joked together, and held each other up when the world pressed down too hard. Sammy understood Dean in a way few others could. He understood the loneliness that came with fame. He understood the exhaustion of always being on. And in those final years, he understood grief. So when Sammy got sick, really sick, Dean felt the universe preparing to take another piece of him. It felt like a personal attack, like God was specifically targeting everything Dean loved and systematically destroying it. First his son, now his brother. The cruelty was almost poetic in its precision. The brotherhood that defined an era. The bond between Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't just friendship. It was something deeper, something that transcended the usual Hollywood alliances. When they met in the late 1940s, they recognized something in each other immediately. 2 guys who had clawed their way up from nothing and refused to apologize for their success. Dean, the son of Italian immigrants from Steubenville, Ohio, who had worked as a dealer in illegal gambling joints and a boxer before anyone knew his name. Sammy, the child vaudeville performer who had tap danced his way through a childhood stolen by the stage, who had lost an eye in a car accident and came back performing harder than ever. They both knew what it meant to fight for every inch of ground. When Frank Sinatra pulled him into orbit and the Rat Pack was born, Dean and Sammy developed a unique chemistry. while Frank was the leader, the chairman of the board, and while Joey Bishop was a writer and Peter Lawford was a political connection, Dean and Sammy were the heart. They were the ones who genuinely enjoyed each other's company when the cameras stopped rolling. Backstage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, while Frank held court and plotted the next big move, Dean and Sammy would sit in comfortable silence, sharing a drink or working on a bit. Sammy would do impressions of everyone in the building, and Dean would laugh that genuine laugh, not the practice stage laugh, but the real thing, the one that came from his belly and made his shoulders shake. People don't realize how much Sammy looked up to Dean. Everyone knew Sammy idolized Frank, but his relationship with Dean was different. Dean represented everything Sammy aspired to: effortless cool, a guy who never seemed to break a sweat, who could walk into any room and own it without trying. Sammy worked constantly, practiced endlessly, gave 150% every single night because he felt he had to prove himself. Dean just showed up and was great. But what Sammy understood, what he saw through Dean's carefully crafted image of indifference, was that Dean cared deeply about very few things. And one of those things was his friends. When the civil rights movement was raging and venues in the South refused to let Sammy stay in the same hotels as Dean and Frank, Dean didn't give speeches or make public pronouncements. He just quietly told promoters that if Sammy couldn't stay where they stayed, they wouldn't perform. End of discussion. That was Dean's way. He showed love through action, not words. He showed up. He was loyal. He protected his people. And Sammy was his people. They would call each other at odd hours just to talk. Not about anything important, just to connect. To hear a familiar voice in the lonely hours when the applause had faded and the only company was your own thoughts. In the 1980s, as both men aged and the world they had dominated began to fade into memory, that connection became even more vital. They were witnesses to each other's lives. They held the memories that no one else could corroborate. They remembered what it felt like to be young and invincible, to play to packed houses every night, to believe the party would never end. When Dean's son died in 1987, Sammy was one of the first people at his door. He didn't try to comfort Dean with platitudes or empty promises that time would heal. He just sat with him. He held his hand. He let Dean cry on his shoulder. He understood that some pain doesn't want solutions. It just wants to be witnessed. And Dean never forgot that. In the dark years after Dino's death, when Dean pushed almost everyone away, Sammy remained. Not because he forced his way in, but because Dean needed him there. He needed one person who remembered who he used to be, who didn't expect him to bounce back or get over it or move on. Sammy gave him permission to grieve forever if that's what it took. The phone call that changed everything. In September of 1989, Sammy Davis Jr. was diagnosed with throat cancer. For a man whose voice was his instrument, whose performances depended on singing and talking, and connecting with audiences through sound, this was a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. The cancer was aggressive. The prognosis was grim. When Dean heard the news, those who were with him said he didn't react with shock or surprise. He simply nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known was coming. Of course this was happening. Of course the universe wasn't finished with him yet. There was still one more person left to take. Dean tried to visit Sammy, but the visits were painful. Watching his vibrant, energetic friend waste away, watching the light dim in those eyes that sparkled through 1,000 performances, it was like watching his own death in slow motion. Sammy, every performer, tried to keep things light. He would crack jokes about his condition, make Dean laugh, insist that he was going to beat this thing. But they both knew the truth. They could see it in each other's eyes. This was goodbye, stretched out over months instead of delivered all at once. It was a torture of anticipation. Dean's own health was deteriorating too. The emphysema from a lifetime of cigarettes was making it harder to breathe. His kidneys were failing. His heart was weak. But he wasn't dying from any of those things. He was dying from spiritual exhaustion. His body was simply following the lead of his soul, which had checked out years ago. In the final weeks of Sammy's life, Dean couldn't bring himself to visit anymore. He would pick up the phone, dial most of the numbers, and then hang up. He would get dressed to go see him, make it to the car, and then turn around and go back inside. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he cared too much. He couldn't bear to see Sammy like that. He couldn't bear to add another devastating image to the collection already burned into his memory. Sammy understood. They had one final phone conversation in early May, just days before Sammy passed. Neither of them said anything profound. They talked about golf. They talked about old times. They told each other they'd see each other soon. Both knew it was a lie. Both were grateful for the lie. When the call came on May 16, 1990, that Sammy had died, Dean was sitting in his living room watching an old Western. He listened to the voice on the other end of the line deliver the news. He thanked them for calling. He hung up. He sat back down. He stared at the television screen without seeing it. His daughter Deanna found him there hours later, still sitting, still staring. She asked if he had heard about Sammy. Dean nodded. She asked if he was okay. Dean looked at her with eyes that were completely empty and said, "There's nobody left." The funeral service. May 18th, 1990 dawned clear and warm in Los Angeles. It was the kind of beautiful Southern California day that makes people understand why anyone lives there despite the earthquakes and the traffic and the smog. The sky was impossibly blue. The birds were singing. It was cruelly inappropriate weather for a funeral. Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale was already filling up with mourners by mid-morning. This wasn't going to be a small, intimate affair. Sammy Davis Jr. had been a giant, and his send-off would reflect that. The list of attendees read like a who's who of entertainment royalty. Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder, Liza Minnelli, Gregory Peck, Angie Dickinson, Clint Eastwood, Robert Wagner, Jesse Jackson. Everyone who was anyone came to pay their respects. The media was there too, of course. Helicopters circled overhead. Photographers lined the streets. Cameras captured every tear, every embrace, every moment of grief. This was the end of an era being documented for posterity. Dean Martin arrived late, which was unusual for a man who had been obsessively punctual his entire career. His car pulled up to a side entrance, away from the main crush of media and mourners. When he emerged from the vehicle, those who saw him were genuinely shocked at his appearance. He looked like a man who had been dead for weeks, but whose body hadn't received the message yet. He was gaunt, his face hollow and gray. His famous tuxedo, which he had worn like a second skin for decades, now hung off him like he was a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. He wore his dark sunglasses, but they couldn't hide the devastation underneath. He needed help walking. His daughter Deanna was on one side, his son Richie on the other. Each step seemed to require enormous effort, as if his legs were made of lead, and the ground was pulling him down with magnetic force. People who saw him whispered to each other, "Is that really Dean Martin? My God, he looks terrible." I didn't think he would come. Inside the Hall of Liberty, where the service was being held, the atmosphere was heavy with grief and nostalgia. The room was filled with flowers, photographs of Sammy throughout his career, and the soft sound of people crying. Frank Sinatra sat in the front row, looking old and fragile himself. He was 74, dealing with his own health issues, and the loss of Sammy hit him hard. But at least Frank could cry. At least Frank could express his pain. Dean was led to a seat near the front, but not in the first row. He couldn't handle being that close, that visible. He sat down carefully, his children on either side, and stared straight ahead at the closed casket. Sammy's casket, his brother's casket, the last piece of his world, boxed up and ready to be buried. The service began with music. How could it not? Sammy's life had been music. Stevie Wonder performed a moving rendition of a song that had everyone weeping. Liza Minnelli, Sammy's old friend and goddaughter to his children, sang with a voice cracking with emotion. Jesse Jackson delivered a powerful eulogy about Sammy's contributions to civil rights and his tireless work to break down barriers. Through it all, Dean sat motionless. People who looked at him said it was like watching a statue. He didn't cry. He didn't react. He barely seemed to breathe. His hands were folded in his lap, and his eyes, hidden behind those dark glasses, were fixed on the casket. Inside his mind, 1,000 memories were playing on a loop. Sammy doing impressions backstage. Sammy defending him to reporters who called him lazy. Sammy laughing at his jokes. Sammy sitting with him in silence after Dino died. Sammy's voice on the phone just days ago saying, "Love you, Charlie." That's what they called each other. Charlie. Don't ask why. It was just their thing. When Frank Sinatra got up to speak, his voice was thick with emotion. He talked about the Rat Pack, about the golden years, about what Sammy had meant to all of them. He talked about talent and loyalty and love. At one point, Frank's voice broke completely, and he had to pause to collect himself. That's when people noticed Dean. His shoulders had started to shake. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly. His head dropped forward. His hands unclenched and then clenched again, gripping his knees. He was breaking. The armor was cracking. And everyone in that room could feel it. The moment everything fell apart. As the service moved toward its conclusion, there was an announcement that family and close friends were invited to approach the casket for final goodbyes before it was closed for the last time. People began to line up. Michael Jackson, tears streaming down his face, approached and placed his hand on the casket. Liza Minnelli sobbed as she kissed the polished wood. Frank Sinatra stood there the longest, his hand pressed flat against the casket, his lips moving in what appeared to be a private prayer or conversation. Dean didn't move. He sat in his seat while others filed past, while the line dwindled, while his children gently encouraged him to go say goodbye. He shook his head. He couldn't do it. He couldn't walk up there and pretend this was okay, that he was okay, that anything about this was acceptable. But then something happened. Frank Sinatra, after finishing his goodbye, walked over to Dean. He bent down, put his hand on Dean's shoulder, and whispered something in his ear. Whatever Frank said, it changed something. Dean's head came up. He looked at Frank, and Frank looked back with eyes that said, "You have to do this. For him. For you. For us." Dean nodded slowly. With great effort, he stood up. His children immediately moved to help him, but he gently waved them off. This was something he needed to do alone. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his sunglasses, and began the long walk to the front of the room. It wasn't a long distance, maybe 30 feet. But for Dean Martin in that moment, it might as well have been 30 miles. Every step was agony. Every step brought him closer to a reality he didn't want to face. That Sammy was gone, that another person he loved had been taken, that he was now truly alone in this world. The room went silent. Everyone stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped even breathing. All eyes were on Dean as he approached the casket. You could hear his labored breathing, the slight shuffle of his shoes on the carpet, the rustle of his suit jacket. When he reached the casket, he stood there for a long moment, staring down at it. His hands came up, hesitated in midair, then slowly lowered to rest on the gleaming wood. His fingers spread out, as if he were trying to feel the person inside, trying to reach through the barrier of death and touch his friend one more time. And then it happened. Dean Martin, the king of cool, the man who had spent a lifetime never letting anyone see him sweat, completely broke down. His shoulders began to shake violently. His head dropped forward until his forehead was resting against the casket. His hands, which had been resting gently on the wood, now gripped the edges as if he were trying to hold on, try and keep Sammy from leaving. A sound came out of him that witnesses later described as inhuman. It was a wail, a moan, something primal and raw that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. It was the sound of a man who had been holding everything inside for 3 years, who had been pretending he was functioning when really he was drowning, finally letting it all out. People in the room began to cry harder. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others moved forward, wanting to help but not knowing how. Deanna and Ricci started to approach their father, but Frank held up a hand, stopping them. This needed to happen. Dean needed this. Through his tears and his shaking, Dean leaned in close to the casket. His lips moved, and those closest to him, including Frank Sinatra and the funeral director, heard what he said. "I'm coming soon, Charlie," Dean whispered. "I'm so tired. I'm so tired, Sam. I can't do this anymore. Dino's waiting, and now you're waiting, and I'm still here, and I don't know why. I don't know why I'm still here." He paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then he continued, his voice breaking on every word. "You tell my boy I'm coming. You tell Dino his daddy's going to be there soon. You wait for me at the gate. Sam, you wait for me like you always did. Don't start the party without me, okay? Just wait. Just wait. The devastation in those words, the absolute finality, the resignation, the exhaustion, it destroyed everyone who heard it. Frank Sinatra openly wept. The funeral director, a man who had presided over thousands of services and prided himself on his professionalism, had to turn away to compose himself. Deanna collapsed into her brother's arms. But Dean wasn't finished. He had one more thing to say. He lifted his head slightly, his tears falling on the casket, and whispered, "There's nobody left, Sam. There's nobody left who remembers. There's nobody left who knows. It's just me, and I'm not enough. I was never enough without you guys." Then he kissed the casket, a gentle press of his lips against the wood, the way you might kiss a child's forehead when tucking him in at night. He straightened up, swaying slightly on his feet. His children rushed forward to support him, and this time he let them. As they led him back to his seat, Dean Martin looked like a man who had just run a marathon with broken legs. He was shattered, used up, finished. He had given everything he had left at that casket, and now there was nothing remaining except the shell that would continue breathing for another 5 years until it finally gave up too. The aftermath of anguish. The funeral ended shortly after Dean's breakdown. There was supposed to be a reception, a gathering where people could share stories and console each other and celebrate Sammy's life. Dean didn't attend. He couldn't. He was taken directly home, where he retreated to his bedroom and didn't emerge for days. The whispered confession at Sammy's casket became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Those who heard it told others. The story spread. Everyone understood that they had witnessed something profound and terrible, the complete dissolution of a man's will to live. Dean Martin had publicly announced his intention to die, and there was nothing anyone could do to change his mind. Frank Sinatra tried. He called every day for weeks. He showed up at Dean's house and was turned away at the gate. He sent mutual friends. He sent flowers. He sent notes. But Dean was done. He had said goodbye to Sammy, and in doing so, he had said goodbye to everything. The 5 years between Sammy's death in 1990 and Dean's death in 1995 were a slow fade to black. Dean became even more reclusive than he had been before. He stopped going out to restaurants. He stopped watching golf tournaments. He stopped doing anything that required engagement with the world. His health deteriorated rapidly. The emphysema worsened. He developed kidney problems. His heart weakened. But doctors who examined him said the physical ailments were almost beside the point. Dean Martin was dying of a broken heart, of spiritual exhaustion, of having survived everyone he loved. He would sit in his room for hours, staring at photographs. Dino in his flight suit, Sammy on stage, the old Rat Pack in their prime, young and invincible, and convinced the good times would last forever. He would touch these photographs with trembling fingers, as if trying to pull those people back into the present, try to reverse time and death through sheer force of will. Friends who managed to visit him in those final years said the conversations were heartbreaking. Dean would ask about people who had been dead for years, as if they were still alive. He would talk about plans to go see Sammy perform, to play golf with Dino, to have dinner with the guys. When reminded gently that these people were gone, Dean would nod sadly and say, I know, I just forget sometimes." But he didn't forget. He knew exactly where they were. He was just practicing for when he would join them. He was rehearsing a reunion that he believed, that he needed to believe, was coming. The final curtain. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. It was almost poetically appropriate that the man who had sung so many holiday standards would choose that day to leave. His family was with him. His breathing had become labored over the previous days, and everyone knew the end was near. In his final hours, those at his bedside said Dean seemed peaceful for the first time in years. The tension that had gripped his body for so long relaxed. The pain that had lived behind his eyes faded. He looked almost young again, like the Dean from the photographs on his walls. Just before he died, Dean opened his eyes and smiled. Not the practiced smile he had given audiences for 50 years, but a genuine expression of joy. His daughter Deanna asked him what he saw. Dean's last words were simple and beautiful. "They're all here. They're waiting for me. Then he closed his eyes and was gone. The man who had made millions laugh, who had defined cool, who had broken every heart with his voice, was finally at peace. He had been waiting 5 years for this moment. He had been waiting since that day at Sammy's casket, when he promised he was coming soon. The world mourned Dean Martin as an entertainer, as an icon, as a legend. But those who truly knew him mourned him as a man who had loved so deeply that when the people he loved were taken from him, he couldn't figure out how to keep living. They mourned him as a father who never recovered from burying his son. They mourned him as a friend who proved that loyalty and love weren't just words, but commitments that lasted beyond death. What Dean Martin taught us about love and loss. The story of Dean Martin's breakdown at Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral, the devastating words he whispered to his dead friend, and the slow dissolution that followed teaches us something profound about the nature of love and grief. We live in a world that wants us to get over things quickly. We're supposed to bounce back, move on, find closure. We're told that time heals all wounds and that life goes on. But Dean Martin's story reminds us that some losses are unsurvivable. Some wounds don't heal. Some people we love so completely that when they're gone, part of us goes with them, and no amount of time can bring that part back. Dean wasn't weak for being unable to recover from his son's death or his friend's death. He was human. He was real. Underneath all the glamour and the fame and the carefully constructed image of effortless cool, he was a man who loved deeply and who paid the price that deep love demands. Deep grief when that love is lost. His whispered word at Sammy's casket, "I'm coming soon, Charlie," weren't just a rambling of a depressed old man. They were the words of someone who understood that his purpose had ended, that the people who made his life meaningful were gone, and that continuing without them wasn't strength but torture. There's something beautiful, in a heartbreaking way, about Dean's devotion. He loved his son so much that he couldn't survive losing him. He loved his friends so much that when they died, he felt obligated to follow. This isn't the kind of love that gets celebrated in romantic comedies or pop songs. This is a dangerous kind of love, the kind that stakes your entire existence on other people, the kind that leaves you vulnerable to complete annihilation. But isn't that what love is supposed to be? Isn't real love supposed to be risky, supposed to be all in, supposed to be the kind of thing that can destroy you if it goes wrong? Dean Martin loved like that. And yes, it killed him, but it also made his life meaningful. Every moment of his suffering was proof that he had experienced something real, something deep, something that mattered more than fame or money or success. When we listen to That's Amore now, knowing what we know, it hits different. When we see old clips of the Rat Pack, with Dean and Sammy cracking jokes and Frank conducting the chaos, we're not just watching entertainment. We're watching love in action. We're watching men who chose each other, who protected each other, who showed up for each other, and who proved that brotherhood isn't just a word but a sacred commitment. Dean Martin's story is a tragedy. There's no way around that. But it's also a testament to the power of human connection. In a Hollywood known for fake relationships and temporary alliances, Dean loved authentically. He loved his son like a son should be loved. He loved his friends like friends should be loved. And when they were taken from him, he didn't pretend it was okay. He didn't put on a brave face. He broke down at a casket and told the truth. He was tired. He couldn't do it anymore, and he was ready to follow them wherever they had gone. That moment at Sammy's funeral, when Dean whispered his goodbye and his promise to follow soon, was witnessed by some of the most famous people in the world. But it could have happened to anyone. It was a universal moment of grief that every person who has ever lost someone they couldn't live without understands. It was a moment when pretending stops working, when the mask falls away, and all that's left is raw human pain. The legacy of a broken heart. Dean Martin died of a broken heart. The medical reports will say emphysema, kidney failure, respiratory problems. But everyone who knew him understood the truth. He died because he didn't want to live anymore. He died because he'd been saying goodbye for 5 years, and his body finally listened. There's a strange comfort in his story for those of us who grieve. It tells us that it's okay to not be okay. It tells us that some losses are too big to overcome, and that's not a failure on our part. It tells us that loving deeply means risking everything, and sometimes we lose that bet, and the consequences are devastating. But it also tells us that love like Dean's, love that persists beyond death, love that refuses to forget, or move on or replace what was lost, is the most real thing in this world. Everything else, the fame, the fortune, the applause, the accolades, fades away, but love remains, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. So the next time you hear Dean Martin's voice on the radio, smooth and effortless and cool, remember the man behind that voice. Remember the father who couldn't survive his son's death. Remember the friend who promised to follow Sammy soon and kept that promise. Remember the man who whispered to a casket in front of everyone and didn't care who heard because his grief was more important than his image. Remember that beneath the tuxedo and the martini glass and the Italian charm was a man who loved so hard that it destroyed him. And remember that his destruction was, in its own way, the most beautiful legacy he could have left us, because it proved he was real. It proved he cared. It proved that for all the cool detachment he projected to the world, when it came to people he loved, Dean Martin was anything but cool. He was on fire. And when they left, that fire consumed him. And he let it, because that's what love demands. That's what real love costs. Dean Martin paid that price willingly. And at Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral, in front of everyone, he showed us exactly what that price looks like. Rest in peace, Dean. You're with your boy now. You're with Sammy. You're with Frank and the rest of the gang. The party finally started again. And you didn't miss it after all. You just had to wait a little while longer than you wanted. But you made it. You kept your promise. You followed them home.